Okay, it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome Alison Wylie. Just a very short introduction. She doesn't really need any, but anyway, Alison is a professor of philosophy at University of Washington in Seattle. She's provided plentiful contributions to the philosophy of science, philosophy of archaeology, feminist philosophy of science, and all the rest of it, and other services for the profession include her being a co-editor of Hypatia, Journal of Feminist Philosophy, and co-organizer of the Philosophy of Social Science Roundtable, and much more. But of course, presently, I can, if I exercise some mind reading, she is particularly happy right now for being the Woman of the Year, or something like that. Very close, at least, to be a bit more specific. She's the Distinguished Woman Philosopher of the Year. And this was based on a decision by the Society for Women in Philosophy. So the Woman of the Year will speak next.
Yes, there we are. Well, it's an honor and a great pleasure to give this plenary, to give a plenary at the European Philosophy of Science Association, and especially in Helsinki, for all the reasons that you've just described. I learned a great deal from the papers I heard at the session yesterday, and I will be revising what I'm presenting today in light of them. So I look forward to some good discussion with all of you. To start, archaeological practice is in process of being transformed by innovative forms of collaborative practice. There, is that better? Can you hear me? Yes, I think you can hear me. What I have in mind are not the kinds of interdisciplinary collaborations that have long been a staple of archaeological research, but partnerships with indigenous communities, with descendant communities, especially indigenous and Aboriginal communities that have taken shape in a great many contexts in recent decades. I'll be focusing here on anthropological archaeology as it's practiced in North America, but it's by no means unique or indeed the most adventurous and forward-looking of research traditions, archaeological research in these respects. The impetus for these collaborations is are typically moral and political and sometimes legal considerations. They arise from demands for respect, reciprocity, and consultation. But what I'm especially interested in, not to diminish those motivations, those central features of these collaborations, but I'm interested in the epistemic dimensions, the implications of these partnerships when archaeologists and descendant communities jointly define the research agenda and pursue inquiry together, sometimes productively bringing strikingly different conceptual schemes and methodologies to bear on questions of common concern, and indeed sometimes bringing new questions to the table. This kind of practice has not gone unchallenged. Indeed, the catalyst for this paper is a particularly intense debate that's been going on in North America, and especially in the US, since the institution of NAGPRA, Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act. It's the intensity with which critics, both within and outside of archaeology, have reacted against these collaborative practices, any kind of project that involves non-archaeologists, that has sort of mobilized me to focus on these examples and these issues. So, and the specific non-archaeologists, what was being described yesterday as extra academic agents in the language of the pre-conference symposium. So there's a whole literature emerging here that frames in broader terms what I've been wrestling with in archaeology. The central worry seems to be that, as a matter of principle, allowing non-archaeologists or extra academic agents any significant intellectual or methodological input fosters a kind of pluralism that cannot but undermine the objectivity, the integrity of archaeological research, where objectivity is conceptualized typically in terms of impartiality and value neutrality. The worry is that it opens the door to parochial, sometimes politicized interests, and to non- or anti-rational values that are anathema to scientific inquiry. And we heard a bit about that in the last panel yesterday, where the stark opposition between a scientific worldview and a non-scientific worldview is alive and well and being advocated. So among recent high-profile criticisms of this kind within archaeology is Jeff Clark, an influential archaeologist at Arizona State University, in a paper entitled Demon Haunted World, which he published in 1996 in reaction to NAGPRA, in which he characterizes even requirements of consent and consultation as an assault on reason, rolling back all the gains of the Enlightenment. The prose gets very stark and purple in this particular paper. And then a more carefully developed challenge from Robert McGee, who's a Canadian archaeologist at the Canadian Museum of Civilization, an Arctic archaeologist, in 2008, a decade later, objects that there are no collective indigenous identities robust enough to sustain claims to a distinctive epistemically salient standpoint. To make such claims is to reinforce a pernicious essentialism. They're nothing but a mystified reification of recent invention. So two kinds of attack on these forms of practice. One challenging the standpoint from which non-academic agents are engaged, and the other raising stark worries about the implications of engagement. Within philosophy, Paul Boghossian begins his 2006 book, Fear of Knowledge, with a discussion of a 1996 New York Times story in which Native American beliefs about tribal origins rooted in oral history are pitted against conclusions drawn from scientific investigation of the archaeological record. The archaeologists in the story, Roger Anion and Larry Zimmerman, who have both have long history of collaborative practice, are big advocates for collaborative practice. They're described as capitulating to a misguided postmodern relativism. In the quotes Boghossian reproduces from the New York Times article, Anion concedes that, quote, science is one of many ways of knowing the world. The Zuni worldview is just as valid as the archaeological viewpoint. And Zimmerman is quoted as saying that personally, I do reject science as a privileged way of seeing the world. Those are the representative quotes that Boghossian pulls. I'll return to other aspects of what these guys actually say in that article in a moment. For Boghossian, such claims are anathema. They embody what he describes as a doctrine of equal validity and a self-undermining relativism about norms of justification according to which there is no basis for choosing between alternative worldviews or the claims made within the frame of those views. And here's just a brief sort of summary or some key points from Boghossian that I'm going to be drawing on. What follows in his book, In Fear of Knowledge, is an extended argument against any form of constructivism that would open the door to what he calls justification pluralism, one of several kinds of pluralism that he's concerned about, and hence to relativism. Boghossian argues that there are no successful, that is, coherent, action-guiding forms of inquiry or understanding that diverge significantly from our own classical picture of knowledge and can be said to deliver equally effective results, results that would compete with scientific practice. He considers just two possible examples and makes short work of them. On his account, Cardinal Bellarmine actually followed the same norms of justification as Galileo. He just applied them to textual biblical evidence rather than observational evidence. And the apparent failure of the Azandi to respect modus ponens, pivotal case that kicked off and figures large in the rationality relativism debates of the 70s and 80s, must be attributable to errors of translation or logical operators. He concludes then that, quote, we have no option but to think that there are absolute practice-independent facts about what beliefs it would be most reasonable to hold under fixed evidential conditions. Moreover, he goes on to say that the norms embodied in science and captured by this our classical picture of knowledge are a good approximation to these absolute practice-independent facts. Boghossian doesn't consider the archaeological debate with which he opens the book in any more detail, but it's clear that on his view, Anion and Zimmerman have no reason to give any quarter where the authority of archaeological science is concerned. By contrast with this assessment, the assessment of critics like Clark, McGee within archaeology, and Boghossian in philosophy, the advocates of collaborative practice in archaeology cite innumerable ways in which their understanding of the past has been enriched precisely by taking seriously other ways of knowing, to use Zimmerman's phrase. The New York Times article that Boghossian cites includes several telling quotes by Anion and Zimmerman that he doesn't include in his discussion. For example, here's the rest of Zimmerman's statement about science not being privileged. He says, "That's not to say it isn't an important way of understanding that has brought benefit, but I understand that as a scientist, I need constantly to learn. What's needed is a different kind of science between the boundaries of Western ways of knowing and Indian ways of knowing." My interest here is not so much in the specifics of the arguments by which archaeological and philosophical critics first conjure and then rebut the imagined threat of corrosive relativism, but in what they obscure, what they draw our attention away from. I contend that these starkly drawn contrasts radically misrecognize the complexity of actual research practice and the contingency of our own evolving epistemic norms. In the process, they foreclose serious consideration of precisely the forms of engagement across cultural and epistemic difference, the juxtaposition of different angles of vision and ways of knowing that have been for archaeologists, as for practitioners in a number of other fields, a crucial source of constructive insight and a catalyst for transformative criticism, to use a phrase of Helen Longinus. Often this cross-fertilization significantly raises the bar empirically, conceptually, and methodologically. So my aims in this paper are first to bring into focus a spectrum of different types and degrees of pluralist engagement manifest in collaborative archaeology. By no means do they all or even often exemplify the kind of stark opposition between science and nay-science that generate anxieties about self-refuting relativism. I'll consider two examples that illustrate the kinds of epistemic advantage that can be conferred by collaborative practice in archaeology, and in closing, I offer an account of why epistemic advantage accrues to these projects. So to begin, I want to provide some context for understanding the emergence of collaborative practice in archaeology, understanding the range of types and grades of collaborative practice that have taken shape in the last 20 years, roughly. By the early 1970s, and again, this is North American-centric, I'm afraid. I'd be most interested to know how these debates have played out in other contexts. But by the early 70s, a primary target of Native American activism, AIM activists, and indeed of indigenous and Aboriginal activism around the world, was the desecration of sacred sites and burials by archaeologists. AIM activists, tribal leaders, and traditionalists joined forces, which in itself is a significant accomplishment. They were so exercised by this that they came together to demand rights of repatriation and reburial for individuals whose remains had languished in museums often for over a century, often uncatalogued, often unstudied. They made these claims on a number of bases, by appeal to civil rights, freedom of religion, where treatment of the dead are concerned, and more generally on grounds that the material that makes up the archaeological record is part of a living cultural tradition, their cultural tradition. In this, indigenous and Aboriginal peoples directly challenged the presumption that had animated archaeological and anthropological practice in North America for well over a century, that indigenous peoples were disappearing or had disappeared, and that the cultural history and traditions to be salvaged were significant not to a living community, but as an element of world history, and often enough as a component of natural history. So major collections in the US are housed in the Museum of Natural History in New York, for example, and exhibited in natural history sections of other museums. This principle is made explicit in reactions to repatriation legislation of the 1990s, that ancient skeletons belong to everyone. Here's a quote from a physical anthropologist that figures in the beginning of David Hurst Thomas's book, an archaeologist who's at the Museum of Natural History. His book is called Skull Wars. These are, quote, the remnants of unduplicable evolutionary events that all living and future peoples have the right to know about. By extension, so the argument goes, no, and again this is a quote, no living culture, religion, interest group, or biological population should have the right to restrict the research mandate of scientific experts, who have the necessary skills and knowledge to make best use of these surviving remnants as evidence. In the context of centuries-long political and legal struggle, these claims, often understood internally by archaeologists and anthropologists to be expansive and inclusive, to honor Native American or ancestral Native American traditions, could hardly have been more provocative. Consider Lorianne Witt's classic 1998 assessment of strategies of appropriation by which indigenous peoples had been dispossessed of their land, then their material culture, intellectual property, and now medical and biogenetic resources. She makes the point that, that beginning with territorial rights, appropriation turns on two reinforcing legal claims. First, a declaration that the land Europeans encountered in the Americas and elsewhere was unoccupied. It was terra nullius. Therefore, in the public domain, usually this was established by fiat of a European legal definition of what counts as occupation. Native Americans were not typically always settled in town or city-like enclaves. Homelands and mobile hunting-gathering tribal groups were not considered to own property, or by forcible displacement of Aboriginal peoples when they were settled. So that's the first move, is declaring that this land is in public domain because it isn't actually owned by anyone. And then the second move is a conversion of this definitionally public property into private or individual property. The politics of property, says Witt, have never been confined to land, and she goes on to outline how the same strategy of alienation and appropriation has operated with respect to all the wide range of other resources I mentioned a moment ago. The declaration by archaeologists and physical anthropologists that indigenous skeletal remains and cultural material are a, quote, human heritage, a world heritage, and that the interests of science should determine their disposition, is immediately recognizable as yet another instance of this two-step move to seize and privatize indigenous property. The second step being justified in this case by appeal to the specialized expertise and objectivity of the scientific community. Now, legal counter-arguments to the effect that traditional territories, material culture, music, genetic information, biomedical samples do in fact belong to identifiable descendant communities cannot be treated as public domain without claimant, are of course the stuff of ongoing land claims and use right struggles in a great many former settler and colonial contexts. My family's home in BC, the entire province of BC in Canada, is subject to land claim at the moment. No treaties were settled. The entire landmass is open to indigenous land claim. In the case of archaeology, these have been the impetus in many jurisdictions for legislation that mandates repatriation, like NAGPRA, the Native American Grave Protection Repatriation Act that was signed into law in 1990. Various other forms of regulation that restrict access to and use of archaeological sites and materials. Taken together, these demands for accountability have fundamentally transformed the conditions under which archaeology is now practiced. Responses to this sea change fall along, not surprisingly, a very broad continuum from hostile resistance through minimal compliance with the requirements of consent and consultation to a range, and this is what I want to focus on, a range of creative, collaborative forms of practice in which control over archaeological goals, practice, and products and cultural material is redistributed among partners. These all, to varying degrees, transform disciplinary authority structures, but they have quite different epistemic and methodological implications. They can't be treated as a block, as necessarily and inevitably undermining all archaeological interests, even though they may transform archaeology in key ways. So this is just sort of a brief outline of some of the kinds of response. Minimally, what's at stake is a demand that archaeologists respect the interests and sensibilities of descendant communities, even if they don't credit them with any epistemically compelling norms of justification or knowledge. So archaeologists are required to actively consult with indigenous communities whose heritage they study, and increasingly negotiate terms of access and consent for any research they undertake, anything they publish on the basis of that research. That's not an unusual set of requirements in social sciences, but it's a fairly new development within archaeology. They're also required to practice archaeology in culturally sensitive ways. This may include proscriptions against destructive testing or excavation of sacred sites and skeletal material, human remains, may require blessing ceremonies on site or in museum repositories. It certainly requires respect for cultural norms of access to and publicity about special objects, sites, and traditional knowledge. So some material that remains in museum holdings is removed from exhibit because it's not meant to be publicly accessible to people outside of the community or outside of a secret society or subset of descendant community. Increasingly, archaeologists are also expected to give something back. It's not just that they should be serving the interests of humanity in understanding world heritage. They're expected to give something back to the communities who understand themselves to be descendants or who are affected by archaeological research, whether they're descendant communities or not. This, for quite a while now, this has taken the form of providing plain language reports that make research results accessible to affected or descendant communities. But increasingly, it also requires, involves education and outreach programs, capacity building, training, and employment programs for community members. So the argument within a Canadian context is that Native Americans should not just be employed as dig bums on archaeological sites. They should, they should be employed, certainly. Local tribal groups should be employed in archaeological projects, but in ways in which they develop capacities and skills that they can, that will transfer, that will be useful for them beyond involvement in archaeological work. And also, archaeologists often report being drawn into community initiated projects, some of which lie at a great distance from anything they ever expected to be doing as archaeologists. Things like archaeotourism, the development of community centers, developing fair trade networks and the like. There's very interesting descriptions of these kinds of partnerships in a column called Working Together, published by the Society for American Archaeology in their newsletter, The Archaeological Record. But that's a range of kinds of expectation with the consultant consultation results in the kinds of engagement that's required under minimal requirements of consultant consultation. In principle and often in practice, even though requirements of consent, consultation, and reciprocity may constrain what archaeologists can study, they leave the archaeology itself unchanged. That is, archaeologists can pursue questions of their own internal definition in accord with disciplinary conventions that define what counts as empirical adequacy and interpretive or explanatory credibility, but subject now to requirements that they explain what they're doing and why. That they don't just presume that this is obviously and uncontestably of value to everyone involved. That they get permission and follow protocols of respectful, culturally appropriate practice. Sometimes these protocols are predicated on distinctive indigenous traditions that include belief systems and oral histories of the kind that archaeologists have long disdained. A classic statement on the matter is Lowy's, 1915, "I cannot attach to oral tradition any historical value whatsoever." And that, 1915, but he was profoundly influential. He shut down a tradition of research practice that was at that point engaging oral histories, and that continues to be a strong influence in many contexts. There's no requirement even when consent and consultation reciprocity the demands are informed by these kinds of traditions. There's no requirement that archaeologists embrace the substance of these beliefs beyond respecting the fact that they matter to those with whom they work and whose cultural traditions they study. It's more or less like the requirement that you be quiet, that you not party like a rock star when you visit a cathedral in Europe, for example. It's a matter of respect. There's not an epistemic engagement there. So the pluralism represented by this baseline mode of practice is, I suggest, a tolerant but non-interactive pluralism, a kind of syncretism in which archaeological and indigenous modes of understanding and methodologies coexist, not always easily, but no longer with priority granted automatically to the scientific when it comes to questions of access and use. There's nothing here to alarm Boghossian, and in fact, the types of statements he quotes from the New York Times are not at all unusual among many archaeologists who don't share the commitments to collaborative practice that Onion and Zimmerman do. Often they signal respect for epistemic difference in the absence of epistemic engagement. It's not uncommon, however, that the process of consultation and finding meaningful forms of reciprocity gives rise to more robust and epistemically consequential forms of collaborative practice. Research undertaken in various forms of partnership with indigenous communities in which, for better or worse, depending on your perspective, there's the kind of interaction that does affect the substance of the science, sometimes in transformative ways. So consider an example that mobilizes hybrid and interactive forms of expertise that begins to push epistemic boundaries. The case I have in mind is actually in British Columbia, Kwäday Dän Ts'ìnchĩ. It's the frozen remains of a young man found by sheep hunters in August 1999 on the edge of a high elevation glacier in northern BC near the Yukon border in the traditional territory of the Champagne and Aishihik First Nation. CAFN is the acronym they use. The Council of Elders for CAFN decided, to quote them, that efforts should be made to learn something about this person who they named long ago person found, so Kwäday Dän Ts'ìnchĩ. They worked out an agreement with provincial authorities which would ensure, as they put it, that cultural concerns are respected while recognizing the significant scientific considerations inherent in a discovery of this nature. The description published in the Yukon Times echoes Zimmerman. The reporter says the project became a blend of traditional values and modern science. Rather than claim ownership, the First Nations shouldered the responsibility for stewardship of this remarkable discovery. That's a 2010 report. And one thing that's crucial here is that the CAFN had failed in making a land claim for their territory, but they had established a joint land management agreement with provincial authorities. So there was already an infrastructure of cooperation in place. Here's well, you won't be able to read any of this, but there's the Champagne Aishihik with their logo, their letterhead. They've since worked with provincial authorities, setting out the terms of engagement, yeah. They've since worked with provincial authorities and a team of research that they assembled as full partners. They actually advertised, called for proposals from researchers of all kinds, and then assembled a team to do various kinds of work on the remains that were recovered. They jointly reviewed and approved all research related to human remains and artifacts, associated artifacts. The province administered the agreed upon research, and the CAFN took the lead in ensuring that local indigenous values were respected in the treatment of the deceased, and they also oversaw the analysis of and interpretation of the artifactual material. The research approved by the CAFN included destructive testing, which is really striking because that's often a flashpoint. Including radiocarbon and collagen dating of associated clothing and artifacts, which established that Kwäday Dän Ts'ìnchĩ lived sometime between 1670 and 1850, so right at the cusp of contact in that part of North America. A full autopsy was made possible a pathology workup and food residue analysis by which they reconstructed what Kwäday Dän Ts'ìnchĩ had ingested in his last 3 days in roughly 6-hour increments, sort of all the way down the canal, top to bottom. So compare this to Otzi, the Iceman, Austrian-Italian Iceman, 5,300 years old, much older. All the analysis there was done using needle testing rather than full autopsy, but these remains were in such a state that they could do a full autopsy. The CAFN also approved isotope and trace element analysis of hair, dentition, bone core, muscle tissue, which made possible the construction of longer-term dietary profiles. Artifact analysis is very interesting. His spruce rain hat, the analysis was of his spruce rain hat and a fabulous squirrel skin robe, great big flowing squirrel skin robe. Toolkit, some elements of which nobody had ever seen. They didn't know what some of the tools were. Cache of food and various pollens, microbes, parasites, and insects lodged in the traveler's hair, skin, clothing, and equipment provided further environmental clues to the specifics of his last trip. Crucially, the research program included, at the mandate of the CAFN, a DNA analysis. Now that is really astonishing. If you follow any of the news about DNA testing and genomic type worldwide research, indigenous peoples have pretty much refused any further DNA testing. And in this case, the Asia-Champagne First Nations requested such testing to see if there were any descendants that could be identified. Close to 250 community members volunteered blood samples for that part of the project. And here, yeah, here's an open day winter event 2009 in which material that's already been analyzed has been brought back into the committee the community so that they can all view it. The goals articulated by the CAFN were to establish where this person may have lived or traveled, and where the DNA study was concerned, as I've just mentioned, to determine what family or clan group should handle his memorial and return to a final resting place. What's been learned? Kwäday was 18 to 20 years old. He traveled roughly 100 kilometers in the 3 days before he died, likely in the summer, almost certainly in the summer, originating on the coast where early in his trip he had eaten salmon, shellfish, mosses, flowering beach asparagus, and been exposed to Chenopodium pollen. Mineral deposits from the water he'd consumed on this trip reinforce the conclusions that he came from the coast. Like, he could have carried salmon, possibly mosses, but not the flowering beach asparagus. That most likely he would not have transported. So the idea was he had to have eaten some of this as he was leaving. The mineral deposits from water he consumed on the trip reinforce this. 2 to 3 days before he died, he drank brackish water that occurs only in coastal marine environments, and in his last hours he drank glacial meltwater. This makes it possible to specify his route into the mountains with some specificity. His lifetime dietary profile, that's from bone core analysis, stable isotope analysis of bone core, indicate that he'd lived predominantly on the coast eating a marine diet. But hair composition, which gives you anywhere from a few weeks to a year worth of dietary history profile, hair composition analysis indicates that in the last year of his life, he'd shifted almost entirely to terrestrial, inland foods. His clothing and toolkits likewise incorporate both coastal and interior elements. His rain hat was woven of Sitka spruce that grows only on the coast, and his robe was made of Arctic ground squirrels that live only in the interior. The community DNA study is reported to have identified some 17 living matrilineal relatives of the deceased, most members of the Wolf clan, with both interior and coastal connections. So this was kind of a surprise. As I understand it, the physical anthropologists didn't expect that in that kind of time frame, that many generations, you would find DNA markers that would give you any kind of lineal descendants, but apparently they did. There's still some controversy about the interpretation of the results, but their significance lies in the fact that along with the dietary and artifactual evidence, these multiple lines of evidence taken together call into question a set of assumptions about ethnic and specifically tribal identity that have long informed ethnography and archaeology, not just in this region. They bear witness to extensive family and clan affiliations that link coastal and interior communities, challenging the assumption that tribal identities are spatially defined. These are social groups tied to a specific region, and that these geographically localized affiliations take precedence over kin and clan identities, and that they're pretty static and stable. There's not a lot of travel or exchange over any distance. This reflects an imposition of kin categories familiar within Euro-American traditions and informed by theories of cultural evolution. The 19th century, tribe, all the way up to civilization kind of theories. It's a set of framework assumptions that are at odds with community understanding and oral tradition. As reported in the local Yukon news, quote, "The DNA research has been a scientific confirmation of something that the people have long known, that the traditional ties between coastal Tlingit and people of the southwest Yukon transcend artificial political boundaries," that is, imposed Euro-American Canadian boundaries. Kwäday Dän Ts'ìnchį's remains were returned to the area where he lost his life in 2001, and a book is forthcoming from the Provincial Museum that will present together all the results. Many of them, what I've been quoting, are in article publications, as well as a full account of the community process. So this is a case in which an existing formal infrastructure for collaborative work made significant scientific work possible. It's work that addressed questions of particular significance to the First Nations that were not on the research agendas of the various fields from which the scientific experts were drawn, even though the kinds of inquiry required to address these questions does fall squarely within the ambit of conventional archaeological science. Moreover, and this is the point I want to emphasize, pursuing this research agenda has raised a number of further questions that have broad destabilizing implications for the archaeology and ethnography of the region. They really shake up foundational assumptions in a significant way. This is also a case which illustrates the fact that Indigenous partners have long had to cultivate an understanding of and navigate the norms of Euro-American knowledge production and authorization and aligned legal conventions. They are of necessity skilled cultural translators who have considerable, I'm using here Collins and Evans's language, and I hope without all the baggage of that account of expertise, but they have considerable meta-expertise, meaning they can judge the expertise of others in which they don't speak the language or do the practice, as well as interactional expertise, the key contribution from Collins and Evans, that is capacity to talk the talk even if you can't do the business, in fields in which they are not themselves contributing experts. This puts Indigenous community partners in a position to make savvy external appraisals of the contributory expertise of the scientists with whom they collaborate, to judge what the various scientific specialisms might bring to a project, what they can ask of their collaborators, at the same time as they bring their own contributory expertise as cultural advisors, museum and heritage professionals, and historians, as they would self-describe. Consider briefly a second case in which oral history, often the catalyst for the most stark debate between archaeologists and Indigenous peoples. Oral history, expertise drawn from Indigenous traditions, was pivotal in generating an innovative understanding of the cultural past that illustrates what a deliberately cultivated dynamic pluralism can contribute. I'm quoting here George Nicholas, informing and broadening conventional understanding and interpretation of the archaeological record through the incorporation of Aboriginal worldviews, histories, and science. Now, it is, of course, the very idea that archaeological inquiry might in any way be influenced by or held accountable to Indigenous Aboriginal understanding of their own history and cultural traditions. It's this that raises the hackles of defenders of objectivity and disciplinary authority. And in this case, what's striking, or what's at stake, is precisely the question of what can or should count as evidence for credible claims about the cultural past. What's at stake are justificatory norms within the scientific community. The example I have in mind is Roger Echohawk. It's due to Roger Echohawk, a Native American historian and archaeologist, who takes on directly what he describes as the confrontational polarization in which archaeological science is categorically rejected by tribal elders and activists. He describes the tribal leaders, religious leaders, as emphasizing the spiritual aspects of oral traditions and treating these as holistic truths. So they're not at all willing to see elements of those bits and pieces extracted and transferred into another context, on the one hand. And then on the other hand, archaeological scientists who, in the spirit of Lowy, dismiss Indigenous oral traditions as irrelevant, unstable, malleable, fictions at best or at worst projections of faith-based religious commitment that as a genre cannot be credited as bearing any literal descriptive information about the cultural past, a categorical non-science, right? Echohawk argues that Indigenous oral traditions should be understood to be complex and multidimensional. They do certainly incorporate spiritual, metaphorical references to supernatural spirits and mythic entities, creatures, but they also carry accurate information about community histories, migrations, lifeways, sometimes geological and climatic events of a remarkable time depth. One example in the Skull Wars book, David Hurst Thomas, that I mentioned earlier, is of Klamath legends, about a war between mythic chiefs, mountain chiefs, hurling thunder and lightning at one another from two mountaintops. And some of the details of this account apparently capture with striking accuracy a very rare geological event, the collapse of a volcano directly into its caldera that created Crater Lake 7,500 years ago. So there's stability in some cases, the argument is, in oral traditions of accurate descriptive detail over a very long period. In this spirit, Echo Hawk develops an analysis of Caddoan oral tradition in which he finds recurrent themes and narratives about the ancestors of the Pawnee in the Central Plains of the US that include accounts of east to west migration and the diffusion of cultural traditions across the Central Plains associated with the emergence of animal ceremonialism and the advent of square and then circular earth lodge architecture. Echo Hawk makes the case that what had been understood as references to animal spirits should be interpreted as descriptions of animal ceremonials. So it's not that the elk actually did thus and such, or the bear actually did thus and such, but that the animal ceremonialist who is representing and kind of channeling these animals did various things. So it's not, as I say, not literally Eastern animal spirits who instructed the Skeety, Pawnee, and Earth Lodge construction, but as he puts it, humans engaged in a specific form of religious life. Interpreted this way, Pawnee oral tradition details historical events and affiliations that are not only consistent with, but significantly extend what can be learned from archaeological evidence about the appearance and distribution of design traditions and Earth Lodge architecture on the Central Plains before contact. Specifically, the archaeology establishes a chronology for transitions described in the oral tradition, which in turn suggests that the expanding influence of animal ceremonialism may explain the diffusion of Earth Lodges. But for present purpose, what's really significant is that this analysis establishes a continuity of pre-contact affiliation a continuity of affiliation between contact period Pawnee and what archaeologists have identified as Central Plains cultural traditions that date to AD 950 to 1400. The significance of this is that on conventional archaeological and historical wisdom, the Pawnee could not have entered the Central Plains until the Spanish drove them out of the Southwest sometime around AD 1600. So the evidence from oral tradition in conjunction with archaeological sources suggests a Caddoan presence in the Central Plains for the past 1,000 years. Not only does this have significance in terms of repatriation claims, but it really shakes up archaeological understanding of pre-contact cultural traditions. So Echo Hawk's integration of insights from oral tradition with archaeological lines of evidence challenges the framework within which Plains archaeology has developed on a quite fundamental level. It's an example, I would say, of transformative criticism that points to the need to rethink conventional categories of analysis that impose sharp, territorially defined distinctions between pre-contact cultural traditions, and also challenges entrenched norms of justification that in archaeology and in history privilege the written or the material record. Echo Hawk's purpose here is to reframe a polarized debate in which oral sources have been written off by archaeologists, frustrated by, as he puts it, yet another collision between science and religion, and Indians who reject insights from the archaeological record as irrelevant to their understanding of Pawnee history on the other. He shows how each source can enrich and extend the other. To return to my purpose, however, the kind of practice Echo Hawk advocates and exemplifies illustrates exactly what is to be gained by doing the, quote, new kind of science advocated by Larry Zimmerman in the New York Times article, as quoted by Bogosian. In the language I introduced earlier, it's a form of dynamic pluralism in which he brings to bear not only diverse but also hybrid forms of contributory expertise, reframing focal archaeological questions and reconfiguring conventional norms of justification that define what counts as evidence and how different kinds of evidence should be weighed. I expect that a critic like Bogosian would object that ultimately scientific goals and methodologies prevail. From a stance of confident adherence to the epistemic foundationalism and objectivism of what he calls our classical picture of knowledge, if Echo Hawk contributes anything to a credible understanding of Central Plains prehistory, it's only because he's well positioned to extract useful insights embedded in traditional knowledge and translate them into respectable scientific terms. On such an account, Echo Hawk is a culture broker who just extends a long tradition of savvy colonial appropriation of useful resources from non-scientific cultures. But this is to miss the point. In fact, it's to miss several key points. For one thing, Echo Hawk is engaged in a process of translation that involves much more than a simple got-it-right appraisal of useful facts, somehow stumbled upon by those in the grip of a not-yet-scientific picture of knowledge. It requires discerning attention to contexts of use and diverse registers in which claims are made. For another, this is a process of exchange that, as both cases illustrate, can productively destabilize settled assumptions about the subject domain and, crucially, conventional norms of justification and held by the scientific partners to the engagement. More fundamentally, to frame the debate in terms of epistemic absolutes is to obscure the dynamic nature of the ongoing negotiations by which we, in a scientific worldview, hammer out at the level of practice the epistemic aims and norms of evidential reasoning, of what will count as evidence that informs our own scientific research. Boghossian's insistence that we have no option but to endorse our classical picture of knowledge casts epistemic norms as static, settled, necessarily foundational. They figure as plain assumptions, as Christina Rollins would put it. As plain assumptions rather than default entitlements that we must be prepared to defend. And this presumption that they are indefeasible effectively forecloses the possibilities illustrated by the archaeological examples of collaborative practice that I've been considering. That is, they foreclose recognition that active engagement with diverse ways of understanding the world can very effectively throw into relief the limitations of the practices, the norms of justification that we have evolved in response to the goals that define our various sciences. And bring into focus cognitive goals that we've not yet considered, and indeed lines of evidence and ways of reasoning we haven't considered. I would argue that this openness to learning from perspectives that diverge from our own, I'm invoking Zimmerman here, this commitment, it's a commitment to hold open to critical scrutiny even our most cherished beliefs, including foundational epistemic and methodological norms. I contend that this embodies an epistemic principle that is central to the traditions of inquiry we consider scientific. Boghossian's defensive commitment to deflecting any challenge to settled conventions of inquiry is an abrogation of this core principle. So to conclude, and to pull together the threads of this discussion, I want to consider these three questions. What actually do these projects contribute to archaeology? What kinds of pluralism do they represent? And what is the epistemic rationale for these kinds of pluralisms? How do we account for the fact, in epistemic terms, that despite anxious nightmares about the threat of relativism and the threat of undermining scientific integrity, they can and significantly do improve the science in many cases? So first of all, what's gained for archaeology? A quick reprise. The Kwäday Dän Ts'ìnchĩ case illustrates how consultative engagement, on the face of it non-interactive epistemic syncretism, can result in a productive recasting of focal questions, enlarging the research agenda. Roger Echohawk's brief for A New Ancient History for Native America, the title of the article, one of the articles I've been citing from him, shows how a more dynamic cross-tradition engagement can destabilize long-standing conventions of justification concerning what counts as evidence, and illustrates the impact that new lines of evidence and interpretive resources can have on established lines of inquiry. Crucially, both examples illustrate how fruitful it can be to bring a critical outsider perspective to bear on disciplinary conventions. The enforced engagement with descendant communities has, in these cases, put archaeologists in a position to recognize just how purpose-specific and tradition-bound and contingent are the entrenched methodological and epistemic norms that define what it is to do archaeological science. And it's led them to consider some alternatives that they would probably never have arisen through internal deliberation. In short, archaeologists are finding that if their point of departure isn't an intellectual version of terra nullius, they have potential partners who can significantly enrich their store of facts, their repertoire of working hypotheses, and keep them methodologically, epistemically honest. On the second question, what kinds of pluralism? I've identified a spectrum of pluralisms manifest in collaborative practice, ranging from respectful coexistence to much more dynamic and generative forms of community-based participatory research, CBPR practice. Some observations about these mid-range grades of pluralism. To be viable, even syncretic pluralism with no significant cross-fertilization between substantive beliefs and epistemic traditions requires systematically cultivated mutual understanding. Archaeologists and non-archaeologists alike must develop interactive and meta-expertise with respect to each other's traditions, knowledge traditions. Collaborative practice beyond this in its various grades requires, in addition, that archaeologists recognize that indigenous peoples and community partners do in fact bring contributory expertise to their joint projects. This is a dynamic, interactive pluralism which requires that they develop significant interactive expertise with respect to each other's specialism of at least two kinds. One, a kind of limited cross-fertilization, a matter of knowing enough to be able to assimilate to an archaeological framework detachable bits of interpretive or factual knowledge developed within or generated within an autonomous knowledge epistemic tradition. And the other, a richer kind of epistemic engagement, an exchange in which archaeological partners learn to see their own research traditions from the standpoint of other ways of understanding and living in the world, a comparative, reflexive move that throws into relief limitations and strengths, problem and convention specificity of their own contributory expertise. While syncretic pluralism poses little threat, as I've said, where anxieties about relativism are concerned, the mutual recognition of collaborative expertise, the latter grade of epistemic engagement, does open up the possibility that interaction with external alternative knowledge systems will call into question the kind of confident foundationalism about established norms of justification defended by Boghossian, the conviction that there are, as he puts it, absolute practice-independent facts about what counts as justification, and that these are embodied in current scientific practice. And the point I want to make is that this kind of richer exchange doesn't necessarily constitute the kind of stark all-or-nothing challenge that Boghossian identifies as the only grounds on which we should consider rethinking our classical picture of knowledge. Nor, for that matter, does it threaten to roll back all the gains of the Enlightenment in the ways that worry Jeff Clark. But it can put significant pressure on what we take to be self-evident goals of inquiry and norms of justification embodied in contemporary scientific practice. It is a catalyst, I've been arguing, by example, for what Longino describes as transformative criticism. I maintain that Boghossian's conviction, his foundationalist convictions, can only be sustained as an act of epistemic faith. Finally, what is the epistemic rationale for these stronger grades of collaborative engagement? The central principle at work here is articulated by Larry Zimmerman when he observes that as a scientist, he has to be prepared constantly to learn. I understand him to be taking a stance of openness, not just to learning new facts, but to learning about the science he practices. Within philosophical context, this point is captured by the liberal democratic conviction that more ideas, more diverse voices and angles of vision is inherently a good thing epistemically. The wider the range of perspectives you bring to bear on a question in the assessment of prospective knowledge claims, the more likely it is that, I'm channeling John Stuart Mill here, I suppose that's obvious, that error and bias will be exposed, the full complexity of the subject and all relevant implications will be appreciated. Helen Longino articulates this epistemic rationale in terms of a proceduralist account of objectivity, that the beliefs we should, as she puts it, ratify as knowledge are those that arise from the right kind of process of critical scrutiny. And the right process is one which ensures that contending beliefs are subject, as she puts it, to criticism from multiple points of view. It's a process which secures the possibility of transformative criticism that brings you to a critical appreciation of underlying foundational assessments. Longino posits a set of four social cognitive norms that must be in place for a research community to function well in this sense. It's the fourth of them that's relevant here, the tempered equality of epistemic authority, as she calls it. That principle says that mechanisms must be in place to counteract exclusionary practices and ensure that hypotheses are exposed to the broadest possible range of criticism. And that's a quote from her. And then she goes on to say, not only must potentially dissenting voices not be discounted or marginalized, they must be cultivated. To fail to do this is not only a social injustice to those who are discounted and marginalized, but it's a cognitive failing. Although Longino recognizes that this fourth principle raises, as she puts it, complex questions of community membership, it requires us to ask who constitutes the we for any group within which there should be epistemic equality of authority. Although she recognizes this, she focuses primarily on what she calls duties of inclusion and attention that apply internally to the members of a community of scientists. And this, of course, runs the risk, which she acknowledges, that epistemic peers who share common cognitive goals and conventions of practice may also share cognitive lacunae about their subject domain, about the established goals of inquiry and norms of justification, by appeal to which, I'm quoting here Longino, criticism is made relevant to the goals of the investigating, inquiring community. I argue for an extension of Longino's norm motivated by arguments drawn from standpoint theory as developed by critical race theorists and feminists in the last roughly 20 or 30 years. The principle is that well-functioning research communities should actively seek out external communities that hold relevant, especially dissident expertise, and extend to them this norm of tempered equality of epistemic authority so that they can play a role in the process of critically assessing the credibility of knowledge claims and the epistemic norms that underwrite them. The rationale for this that I draw from standpoint theory, it is a much more complicated story to tell here, but just I mentioned two aspects of this, twofold rationale. First, that communities of epistemic peers who share these common goals and conventions that they're often going to be the last to see what the limitations of their practices are. Insiders will be the last to recognize limitations inherent in framework assumptions and norms of justification. And second, the complementary thesis, a kind of inversion thesis, that key epistemic insights and resources often arise on the margins, inverting standard socially inflected appraisals of credibility. Those who are socially marginal, those whose expertise is therefore discounted or misrecognized, often have to navigate dimensions of the social and natural world that the comparatively privileged rarely engaged or indeed are invested in not engaging, in avoiding. They may, as a result, draw on a distinctive range of experience and set of conceptual and hermeneutic resources, not easily or often available to insiders or members of a dominant normative group. More specifically and crucially, the experience of exclusion or marginalization may itself be a source of insight, generating critical, sometimes oppositional awareness of the conditions under which knowledge is conventionally ratified, as when survival as an insider-outsider requires you to understand the norms of practice and justification that are taken for granted within a dominant culture, as well as those that structure your own subdominant community, exactly the position that indigenous peoples are in when they engage archaeological practitioners. The experience of doubled vision, made famous by W.E.B. Du Bois in critical race theory contexts, is exactly an example of this, something that puts the socially marginal in a position to recognize what remains tacit for the comparatively privileged. The upshot is that depending on purpose and circumstance, those who are outsiders to a research community or insider-outsiders like Roger Echohawk may be uniquely well situated to mobilize transformative criticism. So here's the principle as I reframe it. That is Helen Longino's fourth principle reframed. It is that well-functioning, that to realize the kind of critical engagement that she sees as central, as necessary for a community being able to ratify knowledge claims, epistemic communities must have in place mechanisms to counteract risks of insularity and dysfunctional group dynamics. And that means, in this case, among other things, seeking out critical collaborative engagement with those communities that are most likely to have the resources, not only to fill lacunae and correct specific errors in substantive beliefs, but to generate a critical standpoint on their own knowledge-making and ratifying practices. So the rationale for extending duties of attention and response to collaborative partners in archaeology arises not only from moral obligations to descendant and political and legal obligations to descendant and affected communities, but also from an epistemic obligation rooted in norms of critical scrutiny that are constitutive of scientific inquiry. Thank you.
Well, I hope at least some of you found this provocative enough to trigger some objections or at least questions.
I wonder if you could comment, Alison, on possible comparisons between prospects for
So oftentimes this kind of comment is pitched in exactly the opposite way. Shouldn't I be horrified by the idea that, and so I'm really interested that you, yeah, yeah. So, and part of, one thing is that Jeff Clark, the archaeologist, the Demon Haunted World, I gather spent a lot of time on, debating creationists. And that his arguments, I don't know this from him, but certainly that a diagnosis or an analysis I've heard from archaeologists who know him well say that his reaction to repatriation, demands for repatriation informed by traditional tribal beliefs, First Nations beliefs, was framed by the view that there's the scientific worldview and there's religion, and we should have got rid of religion a long time ago. And it's come back to bite us, and we have to resist it at all costs. So I'm interested in how you see the interplay between.
Yeah, I see.
Yeah.
Creationists and more recent developments being detached from this long historical tradition.
I see. Okay.
And fruitful interaction is with the traditions that have a very long history.
Right.
And similarly with the native communities, there's interaction with an oral tradition, which has a very long history.
Yeah.
That's the right parallel, not with traditions which have sprung almost out of nowhere.
Yeah.
Literally.
Well, this is a really helpful and fascinating observation, and I don't have much to say about it. I mean, I think the politics are pretty clear. Why? Indigenous traditions are not so familiar to most of those doing scientific archaeology or doing science in general, and are seen as just crazy. And you take somebody like a Roger Echohawk, who certainly doesn't sign on to traditional agendas, doesn't see himself, I think, in line to become a religious leader. He dissociates from the strongest traditionalists in his tribal community. But is able to metaphorically read these traditions in a way that brings them into engagement with science practice. And that, what he's able to do may be along lines of what's happened over centuries with the traditions you're describing. Another piece of this, another kind of comment that I've gotten on this comes from people doing classical archaeology, who say, like, what's the problem with oral tradition? I mean, the big deal was, Homeric this and whatever. And we all went out and found the stuff. So why would anybody mistrust oral tradition? So that's an even starker example in some ways, that oral tradition has traditionally been, among archaeologists, been completely discounted in context when you're dealing with tribal communities, indigenous communities. But when it's like in the cradle of Western civilization, oral tradition is just fine. Part of what informs Roger Echohawks and others who are now working with oral tradition from an archaeological standpoint is work that's been done on how oral traditions are maintained in communities where they are central. And the point often made is that there are very rigorous disciplines of learning oral traditions and rehearsing them and practicing. Instead of doing homework after dinner every night, kids are practicing oral traditions, and they're presenting and being correct and so on. And when you understand, and also the way oral tradition often is structured, the mnemonics built into the way they're organized linguistically, it's not implausible that you would get very stable informational content over centuries. And so for those of us who have lived entirely in mainly in a text-based culture, it's hard to imagine how stable and how robust some of those traditions can be, because we've never done that discipline. So that's another point that's sometimes made. Not exactly relevant to the comparison you're drawing, but there needs to be a shift in thinking about these traditions that could recognize all the different kinds of modalities in which they're working. Yeah. Thanks for that.
Proposal. Before you answer, it might be a good idea for you to summarize very briefly the question.
Okay, good. I'll do that. Yeah.
Okay, your name. Oh, sorry.
Oh, you need the microphone, yeah. I won't have to summarize.
this works.
Okay, thank you very much for the talk. I guess my question is a follow-up, but I want to press you on the following. So, how does your pluralist and tolerant and very interactive approach work when there is real conflict?
Yeah.
So it seems to me that maybe archaeology is very well suited for this kind of either syncretic or dynamical collaborative approach. But I was also thinking of other fields where it strikes me like Bogosian's argument may be more, may have more bite in fields where the idea of embracing perspectives that diverge from your own can be taken only to a certain point. So the question is, how far can you go embracing perspectives that differ from your own? Because sometimes maybe there is a limit. Further than that, you don't want collaborative work.
No, that's a great question. Thank you. So how far can we go in collaborative practice? It's going to what collaborative practice will do is going to vary greatly by field and subfield. So I wanted to work through carefully the details of some archaeological examples. I think there are general points to be drawn, but I don't know that exactly the same model of collaborative practice is going to work widely. There certainly are well-established traditions of participatory action research and community-based collaborative practice in a great many social sciences where I think some of these points make sense and have been made over 50, 60 years. And archaeology is a relatively recent entrant to this area. But even within archaeology, it's not like a little happy valley, everything's going beautifully. It's hard. It's really hard to make these projects work. And there very often are points at which archaeologists, where you'll hear an archaeologist say, I respect, you know, like Roger Anion, for example, works for the Zuni. Many tribal groups employ archaeologists, and he's worked with the Zuni for years and years. And he will be one of the first to say, look, when the tribal council that employs me says we really don't want you to do this or do that, he says there's no mark of respect to them to just say, oh yeah, whatever, you know, if that's what you think, that's what we'll do, that's what we'll say. He comes back with, and on the understanding, he has to explain why it is he wants to do the work he does or why he's drawing the conclusions he's drawing. And there will come places, I don't know if this is true for Roger specifically, but there will come a point where you just have to agree to disagree. And that can mean that you can't publish material that you had wanted to publish. Often contracts or memorandum of agreement provide tribal groups a right to refuse publication of material that they feel is inappropriate or misguided. That's again, that's sometimes cited as like, can you believe it? Scientific communication is being, freedom of speech is being controlled. And well, there are plenty of contexts in which before these kinds of debates, archaeologists chose not to publish material, like Mayan, people working in Maya land who could give you detailed diagrams of exactly how temples with rich burials are laid out. They often say they just don't publish that because it's like, a bullseye where the well-funded international traders in antiquities just know where to land their helicopters and dig a deep hole and take out all the goods. I mean, if they get caught, they pay fines as an overhead. So there's been, there have always been, if the one worry is, well, how can it be that you couldn't publish there have always been points at which, not only in archaeology, but many fields, researchers have decided or been told that they simply can't publish some of what they've learned for a range of pragmatic and other reasons. So I see this as on a continuum. I don't see this as a spoiler concern about collaborative practice. I don't mean that, I don't expect that it will always work. One further comment about, I think what's needed is a proceduralist account of how collaborations of this kind can develop. And I draw inspiration for this from, one way of thinking about it is James Tully, a book, he's a Canadian political philosopher, a book called Strange Multiplicities, in which he describes what he calls non-modern constitutional negotiation. And he uses mainly Canadian examples, language rights, fisheries rights, many of them indigenous. He served on a big indigenous rights commission that created Nunavut some years ago. And his argument is that you need, rather than frame constitutional negotiations, that is Canadian government with sovereign tribal entities, in modernist terms, where you drop your cultural baggage and somehow ascend to or transcend to a level of, Rawlsian abstraction, get principles that it will be acceptable to, you need to start several steps back, he says, two stages back. There needs to be, first of all, I forget what language he uses to describe this, but I think of it as the kind of process of mutual acculturation. There needs to be a process by which the parties engage one another in such a way that they understand, come to understand what to some degree, get some level of maybe not interactional, but meta expertise about the cultural context and norms of practice that inform the partners on both sides, scientific and tribal. And then what he calls arguments of continuity show what the particular claim. Can we excavate this site? Can we publish thus and such? Can we do, what the arguments of continuity show how the particular issue is rooted in those contexts. And only at that point can you begin to work out, navigate a resolution of conflict, or develop an MOA. If it's not a conflict situation, develop an MOA that will specify what acceptable forms of work will be. So archaeologists talk about spending lots of time in sweat lodges and at tribal council meetings and on Indian time, spending a lot of time, right? And they're not just doing that pragmatically because they have to. They often describe doing this as a way of coming to understand over a long period, develop trust relations that are absolutely essential, and develop an understanding that's essential to know how you can go on in these contexts. And they describe that as transformative. So in that process, I think you will, and archaeologists often describe, coming up against limitations in the potential for collaboration, and I think that's to be expected. One issue that came up in the discussion yesterday, where's Inkara? There she is, yeah, in the paper that you two had, yeah, was an example of a tribal blessing at a Canadian natural resources conference. And the question, well, how could natural resource management, from a scientific perspective, be in any way compatible with the kind of entrenched principles of respect for elders? In that, that's precisely not supposed to be the grounds on which you make well-informed scientific decisions. Well, I've been thinking about that example a lot. There's almost no meeting I've ever been to that has tribal representation, and many even without it, where you won't have some kind of acknowledgement, this is the land of, right? And it can be purely syncretic. It's a mark of respect. It can be really sincere, but it may not involve any epistemic engagement. But beyond that, but if in fact you do have a case where you have tribal elders of the kind Roger Echohawk is dissociating from, who say the only basis on which knowledge is ratified is if the elders say that it's knowledge, then as a scientist and a researcher, an empirical researcher, I think you'd have to say, well, I respect that that's how you live in the world and that's your community norm, but here's my community norm. And the crucial move here is to recognize that the scientific community norm is not God in the pole, universal, abstract, transcendent truth of the kind that Boghossian argues for. That's the key move. And that move, I think, can be made in any science, and it's often made by doing historical work to recognize the contingency of the norms that are now entrenched as defining a particular scientific practice. So that's a long way around to say that I think even in a case where you hit a wall and there's not going to be a common understanding, say epistemically, there's still something important to learn, which is just how distinctive and contingent your own goals and norms are, and a commitment, a recognition that you have to explain those to other people. You can't just presume that they take precedence over any other set of interests. So does that, yeah.
So I think it's very nice that you emphasize the epistemic value of different perspectives that indigenous people bring in. And I understand also that, thank you,
that really requires us to rethink notions of justification and evidence. They have to be dynamicized, or they have to somehow be able to accommodate different perspectives that people take. There's, of course, a philosophical theory about evidence and justification, confirmation theory. It's been going for a while. There's a lot of formal work done in it. I wonder what challenges this poses to that line of work.
To which kind of work, sorry?
To the line of work of confirmation theory, formal approaches to confirmation theory. Do you think there is a conflict there? Do you think this is something that will lead to trouble? Do you think it's easily accommodated?
I think you should answer that question. What do you think? I mean, yeah.
Wow. Well, didn't expect that. Well, I can say I think it is a problem currently that within confirmation theory there's always first the issue of choosing a language, choosing a conceptual scheme, before you can start spelling out whatever you have, a probability over it or something like that. So there is a deep presupposition in every formal treatment of confirmation that you have the conceptual scheme available somehow. If you start saying, well, there's different conceptual schemes that need to be brought into the evaluation of evidence, I suppose that is like proposing to completely overhaul a lot of work that's been done in confirmation theory, or not. I mean, that's my question to you.
Well, I guess it would depend on what you think the purpose of confirmation theory is. And if it's a formalization that captures norms of justification, I'm using Boghossian language, within particular research traditions, it can be doing great work, making explicit, clarifying, articulating what those norms are in a given context. I don't know, I'm just trying to think whether, how you would build in a kind of, and you need to say what the goals and context of practice, you know, it's almost like a kind of meta level reflection where you would, what I'm describing is a move that would require you to be clear about the specific goals and context in which those modes of confirmation are enacted, those norms are held. And I think you need to think about the specifics of particular kinds of confirmation theory, how much they could accommodate a range of different, like maybe the priors are completely reconfigured when you take into account, the kinds of background I'm describing here, right? And maybe that could be accommodated in some kinds of formalization and not others. So I don't know that there's a general, my goal is not to dismiss formal confirmation theory.
No, I wasn't thinking that. I think it's actually, it would be rather more like a next level up for that line of work to try and accommodate this.
One place I found, it's not formal analysis, but Bill Regg's book, Cogent Science. Do people know that at all? It's an extremely interesting analysis. He's a Habermasian scholar, but also a chemist by training and does philosophy of science. And he works through a whole lot of literature on science rhetoric, which was fascinating. I knew very little about, a whole lot of critique of ideal language theory, Habermas. And in the last section of that, the third of, I think, 3 sections in that book, Cogent Science, he outlines, again, a procedural account of how you would want to take claims made within a particular scientific enclave and set up a series of, a process of adjudication that subjects those claims and the background assumptions and the justificatory norms to critical appraisal by scientists in near neighboring communities, sort of working out to outer ranges of non-academic agents, of people who don't necessarily have scientific training, to assess what obviously this is going to look different for different kinds of sciences, but it's a process of assessing, of adjudication that kind of significantly widens through a number of appraising communities, the kind of process that Longino describes. And maybe there would be a way of describing in more formal terms that kind of second order assessment. Yeah, thanks.
Now it's your turn.
We have already answered most of the questions, but let me just pursue one aspect that I enjoyed you talking about.
Thank you.
I wanted to focus on cross-fertilization and if cross-fertilization involved in resulting from collaboration. It seems to me you're right, but it certainly reaches the science. But I wonder if it really does enrich, in the case of a lot of indigenous cultures, the culture. So, for example, the cultural identity of many indigenous cultures depends on the insularity and kind of a foundationalist view of their own, their particular religious or cultural views, which are going to be challenged by a scientific view. And I just wonder if, you know, it could be harmful rather than enriching from their perspective. And you've kind of already talked about this, but I'd be interested to see what else you had to say.
Well, so yeah, the cross-fertilization, to what extent can that be compromising for an indigenous community? Well, somebody like Roger Echohawk and many others resist very strongly indigenous foundationalism of the kind you said. And in recent work, he is really taking a critical stance on indigenous identity, and I have yet to come to grips with exactly where he's moving with this. But there's a lot of ferment, is my understanding, within indigenous communities, First Nations communities. It's and there are going to be certainly enclaves within indigenous communities for whom it's anathema to have to engage, to have to so just think of the Laurie Witt arguments, right? To have to defend access to traditional tribal homelands in terms of property law, Euro-American property law, is already to give up the battle, right? It's already to, you know, it's so profoundly compromising, it's hard to articulate. And that's a serious concern, right? So all of these arguments are framed in a context where indigenous people, for better, you know, well, better and mostly worse, have already had to engage. And what's interesting is a case like the Kwäday Dän Ts'ìnchĩ, where a tribal community actually really wanted to enlist the tools of the scientific experts who got involved in doing the research. So I'd like to do some more digging to find out how they understood that and how much contention there was within that community. They evidently felt confident enough in their own identity and integrity of their cultural traditions that they were quite happy to have the provincial government pay for research to be done and help set the agenda. And that's just very often the case. I'm struck by the number of cases in which tribal communities, which have every reason to just shut down and refuse any engagement, say, well, actually, we're kind of really interested in this. We might not believe all of it when we get it, but we want to engage. So I think I guess the short answer is that it seems to me there's a great range of different kinds of cultural identity at issue here. On the one hand, you get the Bob McGee people who say there is no indigenous identity, right? To claim that is just to reify something of late construction. It's an oppositional identity. And yeah, maybe in some cases, but I don't think that can be true. And on the other hand, yeah, so that's a sort of assimilationist argument. And then on the other hand, the idea that there really are reified, entrenched foundationalist identities that are stable and unchanged by the last 500 years, that doesn't seem too plausible either. And it depends a whole lot where tribal group is located. Northern BC, there's a degree of integrity that you don't see in New York City, right? Or on the East Coast where tribal groups were dispersed and land seized and so on early on. So anyway, I think there's not going to be one answer to that, but there certainly is a risk. And one of the things in the political, moral, legal obligations to engage, one of the things that figures a lot in that literature is a recognition on those who take seriously those obligations to recognize when you should not engage, you know, when you should step back. And again, that's not unique to the archaeological cases. There's a big dust-up maybe 5 or 8 years ago about community-based participatory practice in developing contexts. The World Bank got hold of CBPR and scaled it up and made it a World Bank initiative, and then there was this big backlash against that, in which a whole group of authors published a book on, tyranny or transformation. Their answer was tyranny. And the argument there was that, under developing or say poor, impoverished communities are now being asked by the World Bank to take on the burden of doing this research and being partners, and that in fact that's a kind of downloading of demand and expectation that's exploitative. The rebuttal book to that argues, well, it doesn't have to be that way. Anything the World Bank touches is going to go wrong. Why should you reject all community-based practice? But that was a very sharply contentious discussion about ways in which good intentions to be collaborative can impose burdens on communities. And that sometimes the best thing to do is just get on with your own work, make sure that it's respectful, that you have consent, and find ways to do reciprocity. Don't expect people to step up and be involved in your project. And don't expect them to be interested in having you do something using your tools on their interests. So that, anyway, that's a discussion that's been going on for decades in the CBPR literature. Yeah.
Okay, we have 3 more questions and not that much time, so a little bit of self-control might be advisable.
All right, that would be me.
In a context where there's a lot of homogeneity of opinion and methods, it's natural to see value in external shaking up sorts of stimuli and different perspectives. And conversely, I take it in a context in which there's chaos, it's natural to see value in the other kind of thing, in a kind of narrowing and organization of a discussion so that it's possible to do cumulative work and sort of achieve the benefits of efficiency. So I'm reminded of the famous discussion by Steve Chapin and Simon Schaffer in their book Leviathan, where as they tell the story of the early part of a scientific revolution, a lot of what crucially had to be achieved was a kind of narrowing of a community where you work out who's a relevant interlocutor and who's just not. And I think their argument was, even though you might be throwing away a lot of epistemically valuable stuff, if you don't narrow the circle of discussion in certain contexts, it's not possible to move beyond chaos. And you can see Kuhn's view of normal science as a view along the same lines. So in a situation where you take for granted extremes on one side or the other, either extreme homogeneity or extreme heterogeneity, an argument can be made for pushing. So you can, if in a context in which everyone's doing the same thing, it's easy to make a case for the value of diverse inputs. And conversely, if everyone's all over the place, it's easy to make a case for a little bit of organization. So what I'm wondering is, it seems to me that the considerations that we have on the table so far don't tell us very much about where the right balance is, either in general or in a particular field like this field. It's hard to, I think, distinguish between considerations that support what you call tempered equality from considerations that would support only a much more asymmetric view, where the best way for things to go is for there to be a fairly standard mainstream core of work with a certain amount of innovative input from outside. So given that it's always possible to make a case for heterogeneity of opinion when there's a lot of homogeneity and vice versa, how is it possible to move to supporting the stronger sorts of claims that you want to get to, where it really is a kind of symmetry position that's the goal, tempered equality of epistemic authority, rather than just the value of a certain amount of disruptive input?
Well, first of all, tempered equality of intellectual authority, that's Helen Longino's norm. And she's really clear, and I think she's right about this, that the tempered part is what we need to work. And you're asking actually for an articulation of what the tempering should be. No, you don't have to answer every critical challenge when the challenge has been brought dozens of times and met. No, you don't have to answer really quirky kinds of critical, how do you sort out what's relevant or not? I think it's going to be very contextual. My instinct would be to say there's not going to be one. I'm not arguing symmetry as a general principle. Remember, the foil for this is Boghossian, who basically says, we're fine. Our science, has norms of justification that approximate to context-transcendent absolute truth. And we don't have to rethink those unless someone comes along and delivers us a world's, knowledge system that does better in the things that we value, science kinds of things, right? And so basically he's pushing very hard in the direction, I would say, of shutting down the kinds of challenge or dissent that might destabilize a comfortable, confident, let's say even arrogant homogeneity. I think one would have to take a naturalist approach to doing this, which Helen is not that inclined to do, but I think that's where the action's going to be. And somebody who's begun to do work along those lines, among others, Deb Tollefson has a marvelous paper in the Journal of Philosophy of Social Science in which she talks about exactly this tension using Kuhn as the foil between, on one hand, getting these tight, using Bratman-type conditions for effective joint action. The conditions for effective joint action require a great deal of commonality in understanding of goal and intention and coordination and so on. And we know what the cost of that can be. Groupthink and all kinds of, distorting dynamics. So she considers a number of strategies by which you could recognize the value, when you can get it, of tight, focused working groups, but set up like sort of an internal gadfly or competing groups and conventions where you bring them, number of mechanisms developed, discussed, I gather, in the empirical psych and social psych literature for dealing with exactly this question of how you would balance, right? And I think so I don't have an answer as such to give, but I think that's the work that needs to be done. And I think it's got to be done in a naturalized, socially naturalized way. I don't think there's going to be an a priori, this is the golden mean that we should be aiming at, right? And it's probably going to be context specific. Yeah.
We have 2 more questions and no time. I'll give you the floor, provided you make your question in almost no time.
Should we have both questions?
Do we have a deal? Okay. You would be very short. Great.
I'm wondering how far can this critical standpoint on the norms of justification can go after the interaction with the indigenous community. For example, how about modus ponens? Can science question modus ponens? Or is it just like a core field which is like immune to this kind of rethinking?
Are there defenders of modus ponens in the audience? Anybody doing non-standard logic wants to address this one? That's not the kind of norm of justification that I had in mind. Maybe that's what Boghossian has in mind, but I was imagining norms of justification to be more robust, what counts as evidence, how do we effectively reason with evidence, some of which can be captured in formal terms, but often it's not formalizable in those terms. So I don't know, maybe there's a context in which it's worth rethinking modus ponens. Certainly, Boghossian would have done well to pay some attention to the complicated discussion of the Azandi case on that point. It's not as simple as like they just got the translation wrong. But anyway, yeah, that's another story.
So you don't need it?
So,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm happy to talk to anybody later.
Thank you. This was very inspiring indeed.
Thank you.
So the